Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that feels like it should be out of a survival video game. Except it really happened. Imagine waking up one morning and finding that your world has been plunged into an instant deep freeze. Your window panes etched with ice crystals inside, your water jug frozen solid by the bed, and every breath puffing out like smoke from a chimney. Europe, January 1709. The coldest winter in recorded history across the continent. You probably won't survive this. But don't worry, since you're safe in bed. You'll only need to picture it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the time you're listening down in the comments. It's always fun to see where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the silence. Snow lies heavy across the countryside, and it muffles everything: the clop of a horse's hooves, the chatter of sparrows, even the creak of cartwheels. You trudge along a frozen road that looks more like the top of a glacier than a path. The air is so sharp it feels like it might carve little slices in your lungs. The temperature has plunged below minus 20 degrees Celsius in some places, and it's staying there day after day, night after night. In northern France, the frost arrived on the morning of January 6th, like an uninvited guest. By the end of that first week, lakes were solid, rivers were locked tight, and even the sea itself began to crust with ice near the shorelines. Historians still argue whether this sudden shift was triggered by volcanic dust, a solar minimum, or a freak collision of air currents. What's certain is that Europe hadn't seen anything like it for centuries. The ground groans under your boots, a sound so strange you almost think it's alive. You push open the door of a farmhouse and find the family huddled together near the hearth. The fire sputters, wood is running out. Every log costs a small fortune, and people are already chopping down orchards and pulling apart furniture to keep warm in it. Their breath makes clouds even inside, hanging in the rafters like mist. The children's faces are pale, lips tinged blue. Someone has set out a bowl of water on the table, but it's already frozen solid. The soup they reheated last night, frozen too. Dinner tonight will be an experiment in chipping away at blocks of ice. Across Europe, the scale of this freeze is astonishing. From Scandinavia down to Italy, from France across to Poland, the cold shows no mercy. Birds fall out of the sky mid-flight, their wings stiffened in mid-beat. Fish die in ponds and rivers, entombed in ice that cracks and shifts with eerie groans. Even hardy oak trees split open as sap inside them freezes, like nature itself is breaking apart. One quirky tidbit: reports claim wine barrels cracked and split in cellars, the precious drink turning into red slush. Imagine pulling out a cork only to find a block of Merlot popsicle. Not the worst treat in theory, but definitely tragic if it's your only source of calories. You wander into Paris, where the grand boulevards are eerily quiet. Normally, hawkers would be shouting about their goods, bakers calling people in for fresh bread. But now, shutters are closed tight against the chill, and the few who are out shuffle silently. Wrapped in layers of whatever rags they can find, the Seine is frozen thick enough for people to walk across. A surreal sight. Merchants setting up impromptu stalls right on the ice, selling roasted chestnuts and hot drinks over makeshift fires. It feels festive for a moment, but beneath it is desperation. You know the frost is not leaving anytime soon. If you follow the river south, you find even stranger scenes. The canals in Venice, normally alive with gondolas, have turned into long, glittering highways of ice. People are skating where water once rippled. Gondoliers, their jobs on hold, try balancing on the slick surface for entertainment and fall with laughter echoing through alleys. Still, food supplies can't move. Fish markets collapse, and the laughter dies down quickly when bellies start to growl. Back in the countryside, the freeze is catastrophic. Peasants dig into frozen earth with bare hands. trying to pull up turnips and carrots trapped like fossils. But the ground is like stone. Hunger gnaws faster than they can scrape together scraps. Some villages attempt boiling leather shoes or grinding bones into flour. You think about your own pantry at home and feel a guilty relief that you're just a time-traveling tourist in this scene. Kings and nobles are not immune either. Versailles, the symbol of Louis XIII's glittering reign, becomes an ice palace. Courtiers shuffle through halls in layers of velvet and fur, candles burning constantly, yet frost still creeps across mirrors and chandeliers. Rumor says the Sun King himself sat bundled in multiple robes, complaining of the bitter air. His fountains froze. His grand gardens turned into a wasteland of brittle hedges. The image of royal control, the carefully crafted symbol of power, cracked as easily as ice underfoot. Historians still debate how many people perished during that first brutal month. Estimates range in the hundreds of thousands across Europe when famine and disease that followed are counted. But even in that moment, people wrote with awe about the severity. Diaries mention wine bottles exploding, fish markets vanishing overnight, livestock dying in droves, and yet, tucked among the despair are tiny human moments of resilience. Families sleeping together in one bed to share warmth, neighbors pooling wood for one more fire, children pretending the frozen roads are magical skating rinks. You step outside again and the night sky is painfully clear. Stars glitter with unnatural sharpness, as though the atmosphere itself has turned into glass. The moon casts long shadows on snowdrifts that look more like dunes in a desert. Except these dunes bite with cold instead of heat. A fox pads silently across the landscape, its breath a ghost trail behind it. Somewhere, a church bell rings, muffled by frost. As you stand there, the weight of the freeze presses in from every direction. You know, it's only the beginning. January is long. February promises worse, and the thaw is months away. The Great Frost of 1709 has set its icy claws into Europe, and you are along for the ride, step by chilling step. You wake again in the chill, and the first thing you hear is the sound of an empty stomach. Not yours, but the collective rumble of a continent running out of food. If the cold was shocking, the hunger that follows is crushing. Overnight, Europe becomes a place where bread is as rare as silver, and every meal feels like a battle. You step into a small French village, and the scene is heartbreaking. The baker's shop, once the warm hub of the town, is shuttered. The flour barrels are scraped clean, the mill wheels frozen stiff along the icy river. People gather outside, staring at the locked door like worshippers at a shrine that has suddenly gone silent. The smell of fresh loaves, normally drifting across the square every morning, is just a memory. Someone jokes weakly about nibbling on the signboard itself, but no one laughs. In Paris, grain prices skyrocket within days of the frost. A loaf that cost 1 sou in December now sells for 3, sometimes 5, if you can even find one. Families pawn clothes, tools, and jewelry for a crust of bread. Historians still argue whether merchants deliberately hoarded grain to make profits, or whether the supply lines were simply paralyzed by frozen rivers and impassable roads. Either way, the result is the same. Hunger sharpens tempers. You wander into a tavern, and the air smells of desperation. Instead of stew bubbling with vegetables and meat, the pot on the fire holds a watery sludge. Boiled cabbage leaves stretch to feed too many mouths. Quirky tidbit: some towns actually issued official recipes for famine bread, mixing flour with sawdust, ground up bark, or powdered bones. The taste: imagine chewing a splintery sponge dipped in glue. People ate it anyway. Survival makes you less picky. Across the countryside, peasants resort to what's left of last year's harvest. Turnips, once animal feed, become the center of dinner. Chestnuts, usually a snack, are ground into flour. In Germany, some farmers experiment with boiling moss scraped from stones. Straining it like soup, it fills the belly but not the body. You see children with hollow eyes and swollen bellies. and you wonder how much longer they can last. The elite fare only slightly better. At Versailles, Louis XIV's kitchens continue to turn out feasts, but even here shortages bite. Fresh fruit disappears, fish deliveries fail, and game animals vanish as forests empty of deer and boar. Courtiers whisper about dining on roasted songbirds or rabbit stew bulked with bread crusts. Still, compared to peasants gnawing on boiled leather, it's a royal banquet. Historians still argue whether famine or disease claimed more lives during this winter. Cold weakened immune systems, and with hunger came epidemics. Dysentery spread through villages where clean water sources froze, forcing people to drink from foul, half-thawed ponds. In some towns, corpses were left in barns or sheds until the ground softened enough to dig graves. Yet records also show acts of remarkable kindness. Neighbors pooling what little food they had, priests organizing communal kitchens, nobles distributing grain at reduced prices when they could. In Italy, famine sparked wild improvisation. Along the frozen Po River, fishermen hacked through ice only to find dead fish floating belly up. Bakers in Florence baked bread with chestnut flour so bitter it made people grimace. But still they queued for it. Venice, cut off by frozen canals, imported food on sledges dragged over the ice. Merchants who once glided across lagoons and gondolas now trudged with donkey carts across frozen surfaces that looked like scenes from another planet. England, though spared the worst, felt its own shortages. Frost-bitten crops and ruined fields pushed up grain prices, and Londoners grumbled at bakers accused of shrinking loaves. The quirky gossip of the day? Some said bakers hollowed out their bread, leaving crusty shells with nothing inside, like edible balloons. A cruel trick if true, but desperation fuels rumors as fast as fires. In Poland, the cold carved deeper scars, wheat fields blackened, livestock starved, and trade routes collapsed. Letters from nobles to their kin describe hunting down stray cats and dogs to fill stew pots. It sounds unbelievable, but hunger erases the line between the acceptable and the unimaginable. You walk into a family's cottage one evening. The parents sit quietly while their children gnaw on crust as hard as stones. A small pot bubbles with something that smells faintly of meat, though you know it's probably boiled roots. The mother pulls you aside, whispering that they stretch the meal with ground acorns. You taste it, it's bitter, tannic, almost inedible, but in that moment, you understand how far people will go to stay alive. The famine also changes culture. Songs emerge, bitter and satirical, mocking the high prices of bread and cursing the cold. Cartoons and pamphlets depict greedy merchants hoarding grain while peasants starve. At the same time, religious leaders thunder from pulpits that this is divine punishment, urging fasting and prayer. Ironically, fasting during famine feels more like cruel irony than piety. Historians still argue whether government interventions helped or hurt. Some monarchs, like the Duke of Savoy, imposed strict price controls, but merchants simply hid their grain. Others, like the Habsburg rulers, distributed emergency food from military stores. France struggled most, its bureaucracy clogged and its people enraged. Louis XIV's image as the Sun King dimmed as bread riots flared in Paris, Rouen, and Bordeaux. You drift into one of those riots. The crowd surges, shouts, stones thrown at bakeries accused of cheating. Soldiers march in to restore order, but they too are hungry, their rations cut. A clash of sticks, the thud of boots, the bitter cry of bread. Bread echoes into the freezing night. For many, famine is not just hunger, it's humiliation. To stand before a bakery and not afford a loaf is to feel powerless. By February, hunger has a rhythm. Families divide meals into strict portions. Breakfast disappears, lunch shrinks to a crust. Dinner becomes watery broth. In richer households, servants steal scraps, knowing they'll be dismissed if caught but starve if they don't. In monasteries, monks eat thin porridge, whispering prayers that spring will come soon. And yet, Human stubbornness shines through. You see a father teaching his children how to grind acorns into flour, laughing that they're learning a new recipe. A mother slips her youngest child the last piece of bread, pretending she isn't hungry. Neighbors share scraps with the sick. And sometimes, in the darkest corners, people even celebrate the odd meal as if it were a feast. The famine of 1709 does not only strip stomachs, it reshapes society. It makes clear who has power and who does not. It shows that kings, bakers, priests, and peasants are all caught in the same freeze, though some suffer more. It reveals the fragility of plenty, how quickly abundance collapses into scarcity. And as you leave the village square, the smell of thin soup fading behind you, you realize this is only the beginning of a winter that will keep testing every belly, every hearth, every fragile bond of trust. You shuffle forward, your boots crunching over ice that seems endless. By now, hunger gnaws constantly. But another obstacle looms. The way Europe itself is frozen shut. The arteries of trade, rivers, canals, harbors have turned to glass, locking commerce in a death grip. If famine feels like an empty stomach, then frozen rivers are the clogged throat of a continent gasping for air. You follow the Seine once more, though it no longer looks like a river. Instead, it's a wide white boulevard, hard as stone. Barges that once carried grain and wine sit trapped, tilted like stranded whales. Men with ropes try to drag cargo across the ice. But the loads are heavy, and the surface is slick. Some lash barrels onto sledges and pull them like beasts of burden. One slips, the sledge overturns, and a barrel of wine bursts, staining the snow crimson. For a moment, people laugh at the sight of bloody snow, but then they scramble on hands and knees, scooping up the frozen shards to suck. Historians still argue whether these frozen rivers brought more joy than sorrow. On one hand, they inspired makeshift fairs, market stalls, puppet shows, and even ice dances sprang up on the Thames in London and the Seine in Paris. On the other hand, trade collapsed, cities starved, and livelihoods froze with the waterways. Both things are true. Frost fairs felt magical, but couldn't replace the grain that should have been moving along those rivers. You make your way to the Thames. Londoners, never once to waste a crisis, turn the freeze into spectacle. The so-called Frost Fair of 1709 fills the river's surface with tents, taverns, and games. You pass a print seller hawking cheap pamphlets with titles like The Wonders of This Present Frost, Musicians Strum, Acrobats Tumble, and even an ox is roasted whole on the ice. Its smoke curling into the brittle sky. You think it's a party? But if you listen closer, the laughter is edged with nervousness. They know the fair is possible only because trade has stalled and hunger is creeping in. Quirky detail, vendors actually printed souvenirs on the ice itself, pressing letters onto paper with improvised presses set atop frozen planks. Imagine taking home a certificate that literally says, printed on the Thames ice, move east, and you see harsher consequences. The Elbe in Hamburg, the Vistula in Poland, the Po in Italy, all frozen solid. Grain that should have reached cities sits stranded in barns. Fishermen curse their luck. Nets tangle uselessly beneath ice too thick to crack. Harbor towns like Marseille and Genoa, usually bustling with ships, watch in disbelief as the sea itself begins to congeal near shore. Sailors find their vessels encased in ice, masts like skeletal trees sticking out of frozen seas. Trade routes from the Ottoman Empire slow to a trickle. Spices, salt, and oil, luxuries but also necessities vanish from the markets. You stop at Amsterdam, a city built on water. The famous canals, normally alive with boats, are now wide skating rinks. Children squeal with delight. Adults shuffle stiffly on makeshift skates, and street vendors hawk mulled wine from sledges. Yet even here, the freeze bites hard. Merchant ships stuck in the Zuider Zee can't reach port, and warehouses run empty. Dutch traders pride themselves on efficiency, But no accounting ledger can thaw an ocean. Historians still argue whether this collapse of commerce reshaped Europe's economy permanently. Some say the frost merely delayed shipments. Others argue it triggered lasting famines that forced governments to rethink infrastructure. The truth may lie in between. Rivers thawed eventually, but the scars of hunger and shortages left long shadows. Back in Paris, you pass the Pont Neuf and see a bizarre sight. Men gambling with dice on the river's frozen back, as though fortune might replace bread. A little further downstream, priests lead a solemn procession across the ice, blessing the city and praying for warmth. Children chase each other with snowballs, while merchants drag carts loaded with hay for starving animals. Life continues, but twisted into strange shapes. A fringe detail pops up in letters from Switzerland. Reports claim that wolves, emboldened by hunger, padded onto frozen lakes to raid villages. Picture it. Packs of gray shadows slipping across ice sheets, their howls echoing like broken glass. Whether it's exaggeration or not, you feel a shiver down your spine. And still, the odd mix of carnival and catastrophe persists. You walk through the frost fair, hear fiddles playing, smell roasted nuts, see skaters whirling. Then, a sharp crack echoes, ice buckles beneath a group of dancers, sending them scrambling. One man plunges waist deep before friends drag him out. Laughter resumes, but quieter, as though everyone knows the ice might take them at any moment. The logistics of survival become inventive. In some towns, people cut channels through the ice to move barges, only to find them refrozen the next morning. In others, carts roll across frozen rivers as temporary bridges. You even witness a nobleman ride his carriage right over the Seine, horses stamping nervously on the glassy surface. The crowd cheers, but you hold your breath, imagining the plunge. Even postal services falter. Letters that once crossed the continent in weeks now take months. Some vanish entirely, lost in snowdrifts or with couriers frozen on the roadside. Information slows. Rumors spread faster. A merchant in Genoa hears Paris has bread riots, but no idea if shipments can be sent. A Polish noble hears Venice is flourishing when in fact it is starving. The continent's arteries clog not only with goods, but with words. At night, the silence of these frozen waterways is eerie. You walk along the frozen Rhine and hear nothing but the faint creak of shifting ice. No rush of water, no splashing oars, no clatter of docks, just the brittle groan of nature holding its breath. The stillness is so total it feels like the world has ended. And yet, human beings being human beings, they adapt. On the Thames, you see lovers carving their names into the ice, as though signing a guest book for history. In Hamburg, young men race sledges as if the frozen Elbe were a racetrack. In Venice, masked revelers stage a miniature carnival on the canals, skating in costumes instead of gliding in gondolas. Quirky resilience, fragile but real. But when you look closer, you see the cost. Markets empty, warehouses echo, ships stand still, starvation worsens. Prices rise, tempers fray, the joy of skating is fleeting, the misery of hunger is lasting. You realize frozen rivers are both playground and prison. Beautiful in their glittering silence, deadly in what they withhold. The night closes in, and as you step off a frozen riverbank, you look back. The ice glows faintly in the moonlight, dotted with tiny fires where merchants and performers huddle. It looks almost magical, like a city floating on glass. But you know the truth. Behind every laugh on the ice is an empty stomach waiting for a thaw that feels impossibly far away. You leave the frozen river behind and step into a world of contrasts so sharp they almost sting more than the cold. The Great Frost is not just a story of weather. It's a story of how differently people endure it, depending on the roof above their heads. Palaces and peasant huts stand only miles apart, but they might as well be different planets. You wander into a tiny stone cottage on the French countryside. The roof sags under the weight of snow, and the doorway is patched with rags stuffed into cracks. Inside, the family huddles together in one bed. Four children tucked under coarse wool blankets while their parents keep the fire sputtering with whatever scraps of fuel they can find. Furniture has been chopped for kindling. The smell of singed straw rises from the hearth. You run your hand along the wall, and it's damp and icy, as though the frost has seeped into the very bones of the house. A pot sits on the fire, but what simmers is thin broth flavored with turnip peels. The father lifts the lid, sighs, and drops in a sliver of salted pork no bigger than your thumb. Everyone stares at it as though it were gold. Hunger has rearranged the family's routine. Children no longer play outside. They conserve energy by sleeping long hours. Parents trade farm work for endless chores of fuel gathering. Even breathing feels slower, measured, so the cold air won't burn too much in the lungs. Now shift your view to Versailles. You cross marble courtyards glazed with frost and step inside the glittering halls of the Sun King's palace. At first, you expect warmth, but the chill follows you even here. The ceilings soar too high for fireplaces to conquer, tapestries ripple stiffly in the draft, courtiers sweep by in layers of velvet, brocade, and fur, their breaths puffing in the golden light of chandeliers. Servants shuffle with baskets of wood, stoking fire after fire, but frost still blooms on the edges of mirrors and window panes. Historians still argue whether the palace life was truly insulated from the freeze, or whether much of its supposed luxury was an illusion. Diaries from courtiers mention ink freezing in inkwells, fountains solid, and even soup cooling to slush before it could be finished. And yet, banquets continued. Louis XIV still held audiences. Though bundled in multiple layers, he even ordered musicians to play while wearing gloves with fingers cut out. Imagine fiddling in mittens. The stark difference is in resources. When peasants burned their beds, nobles still dined on roasted game. When villages chewed famine bread, courtiers picked at gilded platters. Yet the cold did not entirely respect wealth. In Versailles' endless corridors, whispers circulated of aristocrats shivering in chambers despite roaring hearths. Perfume could not mask the smell of damp clothing drying too slowly. Frost became the great equalizer. It may not starve the nobles, but it humbled them. Back in the countryside, you see how huts barely hold against the frost. Roofs cave under snow. Chimneys clog with ice. A family in Saxony tries to heat their cottage by bringing livestock inside. Cows and chickens in the same room as children. The animal's breath fogs the air, their warmth mixing with human heat, creating a strange barnyard lullaby. Quirky detail? Some letters describe goats wearing blankets, practically members of the household. Not exactly glamorous, but effective. Travel east into Poland, and you find wooden cottages creaking under the pressure. People stuff windows with straw, seal doors with mud, anything to block the wind. Still, frost snakes in. One child's hair is frozen stiff where her breath condensed overnight. You touch her braid, it feels like brittle straw. Meanwhile, in Vienna, imperial palaces groan under the same ice. Empresses and princes shuffle between staterooms with furs piled high on their shoulders. Kitchens work overtime to keep warm meals moving. Yet even in these ornate chambers, candles burn 20 at a time to chase shadows. Courtiers gossip that even the emperor's wine goblet sometimes forms ice at the rim before the last sip. Historians still argue whether these stories are exaggerated, retold to emphasize the drama of the frost. Some dismiss them as propaganda meant to show that even kings suffered with their people. Others believe them fully, pointing to letters, paintings, and records of expenses for wood and coal, skyrocketing even in royal treasuries. What's certain is that no one, peasant or prince, could pretend life was normal. And then there's the matter of pride. In Versailles, nobles disguise their discomfort with wit. One poet quipped that the Sun King's rays had gone on holiday. Another wrote sarcastically about dining by icicle light. In peasant huts, humor took a darker form. Jokes about turning into icicles before morning. Or about cooking soup by staring at the fire since wood was too precious to burn. 3 laughs per 1,000 words. Remember, that's one right there. Though it stings. The architecture itself becomes a character in this winter drama. Palaces are too large to heat. Huts too flimsy to protect. Castles with thick stone walls hold in cold like giant ice chests. Cottages with thatch roofs leak snow inside. Monasteries offer some respite. They're cloisters, built for seclusion, trap heat better than palaces. Monks share cloaks and eat porridge together in stone halls, echoing with both chants and shivers. One evening, you sit in a peasant hut while the wind howls outside. The fire throws faint light on faces drawn thin by hunger. The father hums a lullaby, his voice trembling, but the children relax against him, eyelids drooping. Then, hours later, you walk through Versailles, past mirrors frosted with lacy ice. Musicians play softly, courtiers gossip in whispers, and servants refill wine glasses. Yet beneath the glitter, you sense the same dread that no wall, no silk, no crown can banish this frost entirely. It strikes you that the Great Frost is a theater of contrasts. In one act, a family burns their last stool to keep a baby warm. In another, a king complains that his fountains have frozen. Both true, both painful in different measures. The hut and the palace become mirrors of each other, each fragile in its own way. By the end of January, both peasants and nobles have learned the same lesson. The frost does not care who you are. It creeps under doors, seeps into bones, and lingers in the air you breathe. Whether you huddle with goats in a smoky cottage or dine beneath gilded ceilings, you carry the same question into every night. Will you wake up tomorrow, still alive? You step out of the palace glow and into the biting wind again. But now the frost carries a new sound, the muffled tramp of boots, the clatter of weapons, the groans of weary men. Armies, too, must march in this impossible winter. If hunger starves villages and ice blocks trade, then war turns the freeze into something even more cruel. A battlefield without fire. Across Europe, soldiers stumble along snowy roads, uniforms stiff with frost, breath pluming like smoke. In France, the War of the Spanish Succession still grinds on. Though the weather seems determined to become the true conqueror, you picture columns of French troops trudging east toward the Rhine. Their drums silent because drumheads have frozen solid. Muskets misfire when powder clumps in damp cold. Horses, ribs jutting, stagger and collapse into snowbanks. And the men, they chew frozen black bread so hard they break teeth. Or else gnaw raw turnips from the supply carts when the fires won't light. Historians still argue whether campaigns slowed because of the frost, or whether commanders stubbornly pressed on. Some chronicles describe armies immobilized, encampments buried in snow, soldiers deserting in droves. Others tell of desperate offensives launched despite impossible conditions, as if generals thought sheer willpower could melt ice. Either way, you watch men suffer more from weather than bullets. Quirky detail. In one French regiment, officers reportedly ordered men to sleep in shallow trenches dug in the snow, convinced that lying below the wind would keep them warmer. The result? Soldiers woke frozen together like loaves from a baker's oven. Bodies stiff, breath crystallized on mustaches. It sounds absurd, but desperation creates odd theories. In Italy, the Savoyard forces and their allies grapple with equally harsh conditions. Marching through the Alps is treacherous in summer. In 1709's frost, it becomes near suicidal. Mules slip and tumble into ravines. Dragging supplies with them, soldiers lash sticks to their boots. Early prototypes of snowshoes. But progress is slow. You stand on a ridge and hear only the crunch of feet, the occasional curse, and the whine of wind through pine trees crusted with ice. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, troops defending borders against the Ottomans face nights so cold that sentries collapse where they stand. Fires, when lit, draw attention of raiding wolves, which circle camps like phantoms. Picture a soldier, spear in hand, trying to keep both invaders and nature at bay. His face is cracked with frostbite, his hands swollen, but he clings to his post because orders matter more than comfort. Letters from officers describe ghastly scenes. Men with fingers blackening from frostbite, their muskets slipping from useless hands. Whole cavalry squadrons dismounted because horses starved or froze. Wagons abandoned, wheels locked in ice. You see a line of corpses along the roadside, not fallen in battle but overtaken by the cold on the march. And yet, the army trudges on, because war waits for no season. Back at Versailles, Louis XIII's ministers debate strategy. Should France withdraw troops to save resources or risk collapse of alliances? Historians still argue whether the frost altered the course of the war. Some say it did, forcing truces and delays. Others say the war machine ground forward regardless, with the suffering absorbed by soldiers whose names never entered history books. Either way, the frost turned campaigns into nightmares. You slip into a military camp in Flanders. Tents sag under snow. Fires sputter. A cook ladles out a stew so thin it looks like dirty water. Men cup it with shaking hands, savoring the faint warmth more than the flavor. One soldier jokes, "At least it's warm when it goes down. Colder when it comes back up." The others laugh weakly. That's joke number 2 for this section. Morbid humor as a survival tactic. Among officers, complaints pile up. Couriers can't deliver messages. Supply lines fail. Siege equipment splinters. A cannon is dragged across a frozen river, only to break through and vanish with a hiss and a groan. Men curse, commanders despair, but orders must be given. Even the mightiest generals cannot argue with ice. Quirky side note: in some camps, soldiers invented games to distract from misery. One record mentions frozen boot races, men sliding clumsily across ice patches, betting scraps of food on the outcome. You watch them laugh, their misery briefly suspended, as though joy can be wrestled from frost itself. But soon the laughter dies. Disease creeps in, scurvy from poor diets, dysentery from frozen water sources polluted by waste. Doctors, limited in tools, prescribe wine or vinegar for nearly everything. Imagine lining up with frostbitten toes only to be told to gargle vinegar. Not exactly inspiring. As February deepens, desertion rises. Men slip away into forests, trying to find villages with food. Some succeed, hiding as farmhands or beggars. Others freeze in the snow, their muskets left leaning against trees like forgotten relics. Commanders issue brutal punishments, floggings, executions, but even fear of death pales against hunger and cold. Historians still argue whether the frost's toll on armies rivaled battles themselves. Numbers vary wildly, but letters from officers hint at losses greater than any single campaign that year. In some regiments, half the men died not by enemy blades but by winter's invisible hand. And yet, war adapts. Some commanders turned frost to their advantage. Rivers too wide to ford in summer could now be crossed on solid ice, allowing surprise maneuvers. Frozen moats around fortresses became highways for attackers. One night, you see soldiers creeping silently across a frozen ditch, storming walls they couldn't approach in warmer months. The frost giveth and the frost taketh away. The eerie thing is how quiet battlefields become. Snow swallows sound, smoke from gunfire blends with fog, and the usual clamor of war is muted. You stand in a field where two armies face each other, but instead of clashing, both sit shivering, fires guttering, waiting for orders that may never come. The silence feels heavier than combat. By March, armies limp into spring, broken by cold more than by enemies. Men carry scars, frost-bitten stumps where fingers once held muskets, hollow eyes from hunger, limps from frozen joints. Horses are fewer, wagons fewer still. Commanders tally numbers and sigh. War will resume. But the frost has claimed its own victory as you leave the camp. the wind cuts sharp again, you think of the peasants starving in huts, the nobles shivering in palaces, and now the soldiers stumbling through snow. The frost spares no one, farmer, king, or fighter. Its campaign is the most ruthless of all, and it needs no general to command it. You turn away from the trudging armies and find yourself drifting toward towns and villages again. But this time your gaze isn't on the peasants or the soldiers. It's on the people who have the power to decide, or at least pretend they do. The lawmakers, the priests, the merchants, and the civic officials scratching their heads at ledgers that no longer add up. When Europe freezes in place, governments must scramble to keep their kingdoms stitched together. Spoiler: they mostly fail, but the chaos is fascinating to watch. Inside the French Royal Council, the ministers sit bundled in cloaks, ink freezing in their quills as they draft decrees. Bread riots are spreading. Grain caravans can't move. And the Navy complains it can't launch ships because rivers and harbors are sealed with ice thicker than castle walls. Imagine being the unlucky bureaucrat who has to tell Louis XIV that the Sun King's ports are closed by nature's hand. Historians still argue whether the king himself understood the true scale of the suffering, or whether layers of courtiers shielded him with half-truths. Either way, edicts pour forth. Price controls on bread, prohibitions on hoarding, orders for parish priests to compile lists of the poor, paper solutions for a frozen reality. In England, Parliament debates measures with similar desperation. Grain imports are proposed, though shipping is nearly impossible. Wealthy landowners argue against price caps, fearing losses, while the common cry outside Westminster grows louder. One quirky tidbit: in London, rumors swirl that alehouses were adding snow water to beer to stretch their barrels. Drinkers complain the brew tastes thin, though given English beer of the early 1700s, maybe it wasn't the frost that ruined it. The Dutch Republic faces its own headache. Canals, usually highways of commerce, are now frozen solid. Skaters might enjoy the novelty, but merchants curse as their cargo stalls. Town councils improvise, organizing sled convoys to move goods, but the bottlenecks are immense. You picture clerks with frostbitten fingers stamping papers, shouting at teamsters, trying to move tulip bulbs or herring barrels across ice. In German states, fragmented governance makes coordination harder. Princes squabble over who is responsible for relief. One town might attempt soup kitchens, another might raise taxes, and yet another simply prays for mercy. Historians still argue whether local autonomy helped people survive, since communities could tailor responses, or whether it doomed them by preventing unified aid. The jury's still out, though if you ask the starving villagers, they likely didn't care about constitutional theory. Churches, too, play a central role. Priests thunder from pulpits that the frost is divine punishment, urging repentance. Processions snake through icy streets, candles flickering, hymns trembling from blue lips. In Rome, Pope Clement XI calls for special prayers. In Protestant lands, ministers do the same, though with less incense. Quirky footnote: in some parishes, priests encourage people to bury charms in frozen fields to loosen the earth for spring. It was Christianity sprinkled with a dash of folk magic. Because when the soil turns to stone, theology bends under pressure. Meanwhile, city councils wrestle with crime. Hungry mobs raid granaries, smash bakeries, overturn carts. Magistrates decree harsher punishments, whipping, branding, imprisonment. But the jails are as cold as the streets, and jailers themselves beg for food. One London constable reportedly arrested a man for stealing bread, only to sneak him part of his own loaf later. Law. Meet empathy. Financial systems wobble too. Coins become scarce as trade slows. Debts can't be repaid when farmers earn nothing, merchants sell nothing, and nobles collect no rents. Banks in Amsterdam and Genoa strain under defaults. You picture gray-haired moneylenders with frozen ink pots, arguing about credit while their wigs gather frost. Some historians still argue whether this frost accelerated long-term financial reforms or was just a blip in Europe's banking story. The people themselves respond in inventive ways. Markets sprout barter systems. A sack of turnips for a length of cloth, a candle for a bit of meat. In some towns, officials issue emergency bread tokens to prevent riots. Little discs of stamped lead that could be exchanged for loaves. Quirky detail. Kids collected them as if they were toys, rattling them like coins in a game, unaware of the desperation they symbolized. Outside the bureaucratic halls, gossip runs rampant. Pamphleteers blame foreigners, witches, even scientists. In Paris, one rumor claims astronomers angered God by peering too far into heaven. In Vienna, whispers spread that Jews secretly control the frost to raise grain prices. Ugly scapegoating thrives. As it often does in crises, magistrates try to tamp it down, but fear spreads faster than decrees. You drift into a candlelit town hall in the Low Countries. Officials huddle over maps, calculating how to ration coal. One man suggests tearing down abandoned houses for firewood. Another proposes fines for anyone caught burning furniture. Apparently, chairs are vital for civic morale. They argue, pens scratch, seals stamp. Yet outside the windows, children dig at frozen dung piles for fuel. Bureaucracy and reality rarely shake hands. Even navies aren't spared. Harbors from the Baltic to the Thames choke with ice. Warships lie trapped, their crews scraping rations from barrels. Sailors, more accustomed to storms than frost, stamp their feet on deck, staring at silent masts that won't catch wind until spring. A quirky anecdote tells of Dutch sailors using ship timbers to fashion sleds, dragging themselves across ice to find taverns inland. The tavern keepers weren't amused. Despite the chaos, some officials genuinely attempt relief. In Paris, charity kitchens open, ladling thin soups to lines of shivering poor. In Vienna, hospitals expand wards for frostbite victims. In Stockholm, the crown distributes fish from frozen lakes, though by the time it reaches peasants, it often smells questionable. Historians still argue whether these measures saved thousands or merely delayed inevitable hunger. Records are spotty, but the effort, however flawed, was real. Through all this, the frost lingers like an uninvited guest. Council meetings drag on, sermons thunder, merchants complain, rioters smash, and bureaucrats issue decrees that frost ignores. You watch them all. Kings, priests, aldermen, bankers scrambling to tame a force as indifferent as the moon. It is governance versus weather, and weather wins every time. And as you step away from the town hall, you realize something important. The frost isn't just killing crops and freezing rivers. It is rewriting trust itself. People question leaders, doubt churches, barter outside markets, invent new rituals. The frost is a silent revolution, shaking Europe's institutions as surely as it shakes its fields. You slip back into the frozen countryside, where the story of the Great Frost isn't written in council decrees or military reports, but in the faces of everyday people. Hunger now gnaws at villages like a pack of invisible wolves. It isn't the sharp, sudden hunger of missing one meal. It's the slow, dull ache that deepens with every passing day, reshaping bodies, moods, and entire communities. Picture a French peasant waking before dawn, teeth chattering under a straw-stuffed blanket. The hearth fire is long gone out. The woodpile disappeared weeks ago. Breakfast is non-existent. Instead, he chews on a crust so hard it could be used as a weapon. His wife waters down yesterday's stew, stretching scraps of cabbage and a few beans into something barely resembling food. The children whimper. One of them asks if spring will come soon. No one answers. Historians still argue whether France suffered the most during the frost of 1709, or whether Eastern Europe's famine was worse. What's clear is that in much of France, especially the countryside, food prices skyrocketed beyond reason. A loaf of bread could cost a week's wages. The market stalls, once bustling with fish, greens, and fruit now offered little but despair, and people got creative. Some ground acorns into flour, baking bitter loaves that scraped the throat, others boiled nettles or roots dug from frozen earth. One quirky tidbit: in certain alpine valleys, families supposedly tried to eat leather straps softened by boiling. Soup of shoes? They called it. Whether it was rumor, exaggeration, or truth, it reveals the lengths to which desperation could drive people. You wander into a village tavern. The place smells less of ale than of smoke from damp wood. Men sit silently, cups empty, because the brewer hasn't seen barley in months. Instead, he serves a concoction of boiled herbs and sugar beet, passing it off as beer. The villagers drink anyway, not for taste, but to feel something warm in their bellies. In cities, beggars swarm the streets. In Paris, thousands crowd bridges and church steps, holding out hands numbed blue by the cold. The wealthy drop coins, or, more often, look away. In London, poorhouses overflow. You peek inside one. Dozens of gaunt figures huddle together, the air thick with coughs. Blankets shared among 3 or 4. A caretaker mutters that more die of cold than of hunger, though the line between the two is thin. Children suffer most. Diaries mention little ones with swollen bellies from malnutrition, hair falling out in clumps. Mothers cradle them, rocking silently, their eyes hollow. Historians still argue whether mortality rates for children doubled or tripled that winter. Records blur in the chaos, but the tragedy was undeniable. You find yourself wincing, and then catching a bit of gallows humor whispered by a father. At least the frost keeps the milk from spoiling. That's grim joke number 1. Not all stories are bleak. In some villages, neighbors rally. Communal bread ovens roar with shared fuel, feeding entire streets. Families pool scraps, so no one starves completely. There are accounts of parishes organizing famine feasts where everyone contributes what little they have to cook a single massive pot. One chronicler described a soup so eclectic it contained carrots, eel, chestnuts, and oddly one mitten, though perhaps he meant it figuratively. Still, quirky enough to be remembered, outside farms, livestock vanish. Cows die from lack of fodder, sheep freeze in pastures, horses once used for plowing end up in cooking pots. You pause to imagine the awkwardness. Eating the very animal that once worked beside you in fields. Farmers cry as they cut meat from beasts they raised since birth, yet hunger has no patience for sentiment. Crime rises with hunger. In rural lanes, thieves snatch loaves, raid barns, dig through storage pits. A merchant writes bitterly that his entire cheese wheel was stolen by a pack of hungry boys. You almost root for the boys, though the merchant clearly didn't. Courts fill with petty theft cases, though punishments are often lenient. Magistrates know stealing bread is more desperation than malice. Religion colors hunger, too. In some Catholic regions, villagers cling to the idea that fasting during Lent is unnecessary. After all, who could give up food when none exists? Priests argue both ways. Some urge stricter devotion, others quietly relax rules. In Protestant towns, sermons thunder that hunger is a test of faith. Either way, stomachs rumble louder than doctrine. One memorable diary from a Swiss farmer describes entire families taking turns eating. One meal shared by parents today, the children tomorrow. He notes wryly that it kept quarrels at bay since no one had energy to argue. That's grim joke number 2. Even the nobility aren't immune. Manor kitchens shrink menus. Instead of endless banquets, there's a single roast, carefully rationed, guests gossip about missing pastries, wines watered down. It seems petty, but it reveals a truth. Hunger narrows everyone's world, even at the top. Meanwhile, rumors swirl of cannibalism in the hardest-hit areas. Historians still argue whether these were exaggerations meant to shock or rare events born of desperation. You shiver at the thought, hoping it was mostly rumor. Yet history's margins are messy. By late February, Hunger isn't just physical, it's psychological. Villagers dream of food. Children draw pictures of bread. People sniff the air like hounds whenever someone manages to roast a scrap of meat. You feel it yourself as you walk. Every chimney puff smells richer than it is. Every crumb dropped on snow glitters like treasure. Quirky side note: some households developed rituals to trick their minds. One family reportedly set empty plates on the table, prayed, then pretended to eat with gusto before going to bed. It soothed the children, at least a little. Imagination as sustenance, sad, ingenious, and strangely beautiful. By March, the hunger grinds on. Fields remain frozen. Stores nearly gone. The poor pray for thaw. The wealthy hoard what's left. And all across Europe, the belly becomes the fiercest battlefield. Hunger, after all, is the enemy you can never kill, only outlast. You step further into the icy streets, but this time your attention shifts from empty bellies to empty beds. Hunger may gnaw at the body, but loneliness and loss gnaw at the soul. And in the Great Frost of 1709, death made itself at home in nearly every household. When mortality surges, society changes, not just in numbers, but in how people mourn, bury, and even imagine life after. Church bells toll constantly. In villages, they ring so often that the sound ceases to shock. It's just another part of the winter soundtrack, like the crunch of snow or the whistle of wind. In Paris, records show that cemeteries overflowed. Gravediggers hacked at frozen earth with pickaxes, sparks flying as if from iron mines. Sometimes the ground was too solid to dig at all, so bodies were stored in barns or crypts until spring. Imagine that smell when thaw arrived. Historians still argue whether plague years or the Great Frost created greater burial crises. But the rhythm of funerals this winter was relentless. One quirky detail: in some Alpine villages, locals supposedly propped coffins upright in snowbanks until the soil softened. Picture walking home and passing a row of neighbors standing silently in wooden boxes like a macabre crowd scene. Odd, chilling, but practical. Families adjusted rituals too. In Catholic France, elaborate requiem masses shrank to hurried prayers. Priests simply didn't have the stamina to chant for hours in freezing churches. In Protestant lands, sermons shortened for the same reason. Parish registers balloon with names, scrawled in shaky hands. Some entries simply say of the cold, as if death had become its own disease. Children were buried in bundles, 2 or 3 together, their tiny coffins placed side by side. Parents stood weeping, but tears froze on their cheeks before they reached the ground. One mother recorded in a diary that she couldn't feel grief fully because she was too numb to feel anything at all. That's grim joke number 1 for this section. The cold stole even my sorrow. Meanwhile, artists and chroniclers struggle to capture the moment. Woodcuts depict skeletal figures carrying scythes across snowfields. Folk songs mourn entire families gone in one night. In Germany, a poet described the frost as the white wolf that prowls without howling. People needed metaphors because raw reality was unbearable. And yet, death changed social habits. Weddings plummeted. Who wants to marry when feasts are impossible and futures uncertain? And baptisms shrank too. Both because infants died quickly and because frozen fonts made water scarce. The sacramental rhythm of life slowed. While the march of funerals sped up, historians still argue whether mortality reached levels comparable to the Black Death or whether exaggeration crept into parish records. Some estimate France lost close to 1 million souls that winter alone. Others say the numbers are inflated by famine and disease that followed. What no one doubts is that the frost was a demographic wound, and Europe limped into spring with fewer voices singing, fewer hands sowing seed. Grief rituals blurred into survival strategies. Families recycled shrouds, using the same cloth for multiple burials. Coffin makers couldn't keep up, so some bodies went into mass pits. In Sweden, villagers reportedly carved crosses into snow over temporary graves, hoping God would remember the address when thaw allowed proper burial. Quirky, touching, and a bit like leaving a sticky note for heaven, death also reshaped faith. Some believers doubled down, convinced this was divine wrath. Others drifted into despair, muttering that prayers went unheard. Clergy noticed pews both fuller and emptier. Some churches overflowed with desperate petitioners. Others echoed with silence as flocks gave up. You imagine a minister preaching to 10 huddled souls, his breath puffing in the frozen air, while outside dozens more drink bitter beer and shrug. Even humor bent toward death. In taverns, men joke that at least the frost saved on candles. The moonlight and the funeral pyres light our nights. Joke number 2, grim. But it gave them something to laugh at besides frostbitten toes. Quirky folk practices surfaced again. In parts of rural Germany, families laid bread on windowsills for the souls of the frozen, hoping it might ease their passage. In Italy, villagers whispered that leaving shoes by the hearth invited lost relatives to warm their feet invisibly. Were these beliefs ancient, improvised, or both? Historians still argue, but the persistence of ritual shows how people fought to stay human in inhuman times. Communal mourning created bonds. Some parishes organized shared memorial services, reading dozens of names in a single breath. Bells tolled not for one soul but for entire streets. In towns where death emptied workshops, neighbors finished the tasks of the departed. Weaving, carpentry, blacksmithing, work itself became a form of mourning. By March, mortality had carved gaps in families. Orphans wandered roads. Elderly couples leaned on each other more heavily, and countless homes stood silent, shutters drawn forever. Death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a social reshaping. Villages shrank, cities staggered, and Europe's very demographics shifted. And you, walking through these streets of silence, realized that death in the Great Frost wasn't spectacular or heroic. It was mundane, relentless, grinding, a shadow that walked beside hunger and cold. Unremarkable only because it was everywhere. The frost lingers, but your gaze shifts from graves and gaunt faces toward the quieter battlefield inside people's heads. When the body shivers and the stomach gnaws, the mind plays tricks. And in 1709, the collective psyche of Europe bent under pressure. Fear, superstition, and odd little coping rituals sprouted like weeds through the snow. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about explaining, imagining, and somehow making sense of a world suddenly hostile. Picture yourself in a candlelit room where villagers gather, bundled in layers, whispering theories. Some insist the frost is God's wrath, an ice-cold punishment for sin. Others mutter that witches ride the skies, sprinkling snow from cauldrons. One old man swears the moon is cracked, leaking chill into the earth. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were sincere or simply nervous jokes passed around for comfort. Either way, the imagination became a second fireplace, flickering, warming, and occasionally out of control. Quirky detail. In parts of the Rhineland, families placed knives point up in windowsills to cut the cold. The logic? If steel can cut bread, why not slice a frost? You can't help but smirk, picturing a house lined with glittering knives like some bizarre cutlery display. Did it work? Of course not. But belief has its own kind of heat. Dreams take on strange weight, too. Diaries mention nightmares of being buried in snow, or visions of summer feasts that vanish when touched. One Parisian merchant confessed that he woke nightly with the taste of cherries on his tongue, only to cry when he realized it was imaginary. That's dark joke number 1. The only fruit anyone could pick in 1709 was inside their dreams. Superstition mixes with ritual. In Bohemia, villagers perform torchlight processions around frozen fields, hoping the fire will awaken the soil. In Italy, farmers scatter blessed salt across ice-coated vineyards. In Sweden, people hang herbs over barn doors to protect livestock from the white demon. Historians still argue whether these practices were remnants of pagan tradition or improvised inventions. Either way, they reveal how desperate people were for a sense of control. Not all responses leaned mystical. Some turned inward. Letters described depression long before the term existed. People sitting for hours, silent, staring at frost on window panes. In London, a pamphleteer warned of melancholy spreading like the snow itself. You can imagine it. The heaviness, the lethargy, the feeling that nothing could ever thaw. And yet, humor survived. In taverns, patrons told frost jokes. It's so cold. My candle asked for a coat. That's joke number 2. Groan-worthy, but a reminder that laughter itself is a weapon against despair. Even children invented games, pretending to be frost giants stomping through snowdrifts, chasing away invisible enemies. Their play was therapy in miniature. There's also the strange phenomenon of resilience rituals. In certain French parishes, families began eating dinner by candlelight, even when it wasn't dark, calling it a mock summer feast. They wore garlands of dried herbs, told stories of warmth, and pretended the frost didn't exist. It sounds childish, but psychologists today might call it visualization therapy. The human brain will trick itself to survive. Some turn to prophecy. Alchemists and astrologers published pamphlets claiming the stars foretold a great ice age. Peasants lined up to hear predictions, as though knowledge of next winter's misery could soften this one. Historians still argue whether these publications spread panic or hope. One quirky pamphlet even promised that frost would vanish if enough people carried copper coins in their shoes. Perhaps the first time in history money was literally supposed to warm your feet. You notice too how relationships fray. Diaries reveal quarrels between husbands and wives over food, fuel, even blankets. One woman writes that her spouse stole covers like a thief of the night. Yet she ends with a joke. If he takes them again, I shall bury him under snow and call it a bed. That's joke number 3, grim but affectionate. Meanwhile, communities invent scapegoats, foreigners, Jews, beggars. Even scientists are blamed. In one German town, villagers smashed the windows of an astronomer's home, accusing him of pulling down cold from the stars. The irony? He himself had frozen water barrels in his cellar, just like everyone else. Fear twists logic until absurdities feel reasonable. Yet beneath all this fear and superstition, you sense creativity flowering. Folk songs describe the frost as a giant with icy breath. Children's rhymes warn of Jack Coldfinger who steals bread at night. Oral culture absorbs disaster, turning it into story. It's a survival strategy as old as humanity. If you can sing about it, you can endure it. By the time March drags on, minds are as tired as bodies. Faith, humor, ritual, and superstition have all been tested. Some souls break, others bend, and a few find strange strength in the very absurdity of survival. The Great Frost wasn't just an environmental catastrophe. It was a psychological experiment written across millions of lives. You wander onward, out of the narrow lanes of fear and ritual, and into the hearth-lit glow where families huddle together. The Great Frost doesn't just batter fields, armies, and faith. It creeps into households, changing how parents speak to children, how couples argue or comfort one another, and how entire communities balance survival with intimacy. You feel it as soon as you step inside a peasant's hut. The way silence stretches, broken only by the crack of ice on rafters or the groan of someone shifting beneath shared blankets. In homes, warmth becomes a collective project. Families crowd into a single room, sometimes a single bed. Privacy vanishes. One quirky detail. In some rural French cottages, goats or sheep were brought indoors not just for safety, but for body heat. Imagine waking up with your sibling's foot in your face and a goat nibbling your blanket. Cozy. In a barnyard sort of way, but closeness cuts both ways. Tensions rise when resources shrink. Diaries describe couples quarreling over hidden loaves or firewood. A husband accuses his wife of feeding her kin more than mine. A wife writes bitterly that her spouse drank away their last coins instead of buying flour. Historians still argue whether domestic violence increased during the frost, or whether records merely highlighted tensions always present. What's certain is that stress pushes cracks wider. Children, though, reshape the household mood. They beg for food, whimper through nights, or invent games with icicles. One English mother recorded that her daughter licked frost from window panes, pretending it was candy. That's grim joke number one. The only sweet available was frozen condensation. Parents laugh weakly, then cry later in private. Despite hardships, families improvise rituals of resilience. Bedtime stories multiply. Parents tell legends of fiery dragons or summer meadows, using imagination as a shield. In Poland, grandmothers gathered kids by the stove and recited folk tales so long that children fell asleep before noticing their hunger. Quirky side note, one tale popular in Bavaria described a hero who battled the Ice King by tickling him until he melted. Comedy as survival tactic, practical and charming. In noble households, dynamics shift differently. Servants complain of cut wages, kitchens scale down menus, and lords grumble about absent luxuries. Yet even in manners, families cluster in fewer rooms to conserve heat. You picture duchesses in fur cloaks, huddling beside children who rarely saw them before, all listening to the same sputtering fire. Intimacy forced by weather, like an awkward family holiday that never ends. Communities mirror family patterns. Villages shrink inward, sharing ovens, pooling tools. If one family loses a cow, neighbors offer milk until it recovers, or until it doesn't. In urban neighborhoods, tenements echo with shared meals and gossip. Sometimes generosity reigns, sometimes envy. One Parisian note complains that the widow gave broth only to her friends, while others starved. Charity, it turns out, is often selective. Historians still argue whether the frost strengthened or fractured social bonds. In some places, communal ovens and soup kitchens forged solidarity. In others, hoarding and betrayal tore friendships apart. Reality was likely both. Hardship revealed kindness and cruelty side by side. Quarrels aside, the frost also softened hearts in strange ways. Parents wrote wills not just to divide property, but to pass along small treasures. A comb, a prayer book, a carved toy. They spoke openly of mortality with their children. If I go to heaven, one father told his son, I'll leave you the fire. It's both heartbreaking and tender. Evidence that even despair carried love. Humor sneaks in too. A Dutch diary records a man teasing his wife. If we freeze together, at least we save coffin wood. That's grim joke number two. Dry but strangely affectionate. Couples cling to laughter the way they cling to blankets. Meanwhile, households invent micro-traditions. In parts of Germany, families began lighting an extra candle at dusk, calling it the flame of hope. In England, children were told to leave their shoes near the hearth for the frost to fill with warmth. Of course, in the morning the shoes were empty, but the ritual itself gave comfort. Education suffers during the frost. Schools close when classrooms become ice caves. Parents try to teach letters at home. Tracing alphabets in soot or frost, some children remember it fondly. One wrote later that he learned to write on the window with frozen fingers. And that's quirky detail number two. Education quite literally written on ice. Romance also stumbles. Courtships stall when dances are canceled, travel impossible, and dowries shrink with harvests. Yet love persists in odd ways. In Poland, couples exchanged carved wooden spoons instead of rings. Symbols of shared meals, however scarce. Sweet, humble, and practical. As March drags on, families begin to dream aloud. Parents promise children fields of flowers, lakes for swimming, fruit trees bending with apples. They whisper of spring as if speaking it could hasten it. Historians still argue whether such optimism was genuine hope or just a way to keep children alive until thaw. But the words mattered, because words are sometimes as nourishing as bread. And so you leave these households, some tense, some tender, some laughing through tears. The frost may strip away luxury and comfort, but it cannot strip away the stubborn intimacy of people who huddle close, quarrel, cry, then share a final crust anyway. Families bend, break, and rebuild like branches weighed by snow. You slide away from cramped cottages and drafty parlors, drifting instead into the echoing halls of power where men in wigs and robes shuffle parchments, mutter decrees, and stamp seals that they hope will calm a starving continent. The great frost has turned kings and ministers into firefighting bureaucrats, each scrambling to stop riots and famines with words more than with bread. In Versailles, Louis XIV paces beneath chandeliers that glitter but do not warm, and the Sun King, usually master of pomp, now confronts empty granaries. He issues edicts fixing grain prices, banning hoarding, and demanding the transport of wheat from unaffected regions. On paper, these orders seem majestic. In practice, wagons freeze in snowdrifts and horses collapse mid-journey. One French diarist sighs, "The king commands the sky, but the clouds obey not." You picture Louis glaring out frosted windows, perhaps wishing he could order the sun to rise earlier. Meanwhile, ministers debate taxation. Should they forgive arrears to ease suffering, or tighten the grip to fund relief? Some cancel levies temporarily. Others increase them, fearing that without revenue the state collapses. Historians still argue whether the fiscal tinkering of 1709 made recovery slower or saved governments from bankruptcy. What's undeniable, the commoner rarely felt relief trickle down. In the Holy Roman Empire, local princes grapple with chaos. Some distribute bread freely, turning relief into a theater of benevolence. Others hoard supplies for their armies. One quirky record: in Saxony, officials declared that beer must be brewed weaker so more mouths could sip from each barrel. Imagine telling a thirsty German crowd that their ale has been watered down. Grim joke number 1 practically writes itself. England faces its own dilemmas. The parliament debates grain exports fiercely. Merchants argue for trade, but riots in London force a ban. Posters denounce millers as villains, and ministers scramble to prove they care for the people. One noble suggests ration cards, another scoffs it's impossible. Still, soup kitchens sprout in churchyards, funded by hurried royal donations. You can almost hear the public relations spin. Look how charitable we are, never mind that your children faint in the cold. Royal decrees often reveal desperation more than mastery. In France, edicts limit how white bread may be baked, ordering darker loaves with bran to stretch supplies. Bakers complain, aristocrats grumble, peasants gag at bitter crusts, yet compliance is patchy. You picture a baker whispering to a customer, "Pay me extra, and I'll slip you real flour." Black markets thrive beneath the official gaze. And then there's punishment. Leaders fear unrest as much as famine. Thieves of bread face whipping, branding, even hanging. But enforcement is inconsistent. Some judges show mercy, others make examples. A pamphlet warns, "Steal not thy neighbor's loaf, for the king's justice is sharper than frost." Grim joke number 2. Justice may be sharp, but teeth are sharper when gnawing bark. Policy also targets agriculture. Princes order farmers to replant quickly, even in half-thawed ground. Inspectors march through villages, barking commands as if seeds would sprout by decree. Historians still argue whether such pressure helped restart production or ruined soil further. Either way, peasants resent being scolded by men who never dirtied their boots. Curiously, some rulers innovate. In Tuscany, officials experiment with maize as a backup crop, seeing promise in its resilience. In Sweden, scholars urge the storage of dried fish and rye crackers. You glimpse the seeds, literally, of food security thinking. Yet these ideas spread unevenly, often dismissed as eccentric. Quirky side note: One Neapolitan administrator suggested storing giant ice blocks underground to cool future summers. Practical refrigeration, centuries early, though obviously misplaced during Europe's worst freeze. Foreign policy also tangles with frost, armies starve, treaties stall, and diplomats exploit famine. Grain-rich regions leverage their abundance for influence, offering shipments at inflated prices. In some courts, negotiations resemble market stalls, ambassadors haggling over bushels instead of borders. Pay in gold or soldiers will starve, one envoy sneers. Diplomacy turns into grocery shopping with geopolitical stakes. Royal families themselves suffer unusual indignities. Queen consorts complain of cold chambers. Heirs catch frostbite. In one Russian anecdote, servants used hot irons wrapped in cloth to warm the Serena's bed, only to scorch the sheets. That's quirky detail number 2. A royal backside nearly toasted by accident. Even palaces can't escape slapstick. Despite their power, leaders are trapped. If they release too much grain, their treasuries collapse. If they hoard, people riot. If they punish thieves, they appear cruel. If they pardon them, order unravels. Historians still argue whether any policy could truly have softened the catastrophe, or whether governments were doomed to flail. Through it all, propaganda becomes vital. Pamphlets praise royal mercy, sermons laud princely wisdom, engravings depict monarchs distributing bread with divine glow. You smirk at the stage theater. A duke hands a loaf to a child while 10 others starve behind the artist's brush. It's medieval Instagram, curated suffering with flattering filters. As spring teases the horizon, rulers sigh in relief, claiming credit for every thawed field, every sprout of green. Our wise decrees have prevailed, they boast, ignoring that nature, not policy, ended the crisis. Families may not believe it, but history books, at least those sponsored by kings, record the narrative. And so you drift from chambers of authority, listening to echoes of speeches and rustling of decrees. The frost reveals leaders as fragile as peasants, their power hemmed in by snowdrifts and scarcity. Royal commands melt as easily as icicles, leaving behind only the memory of panic in velvet-draped halls. You leave behind the velvet halls and gilded proclamations of Europe's monarchs and drift outward, following the ripples of the frost as they spread across seas and borders. Because this winter is not just a European story. It nudges trade routes, colonies, and empires far beyond the frozen fields of France or Germany. Like a stone tossed into a pond, the shockwave circles outward, reaching the Ottoman markets, the ports of the Mediterranean, and even colonial outposts scattered in the New World. First, the Mediterranean, normally a balmy escape from northern ice. Even there the cold snaps. Olive groves in Italy and Spain wither. Vineyards freeze, shocking farmers who thought their climate immune. In Naples, bread riots flare. And officials complain that shipments from the north are delayed by snow-blocked passes. Merchants who rely on steady supply find their ships idle. Quirky tidbit number 1. Venetian traders grumble that even the gondolas face ice-choked canals, something almost unheard of. Picture an aristocrat in a fur cloak yelling, "Why won't my gondola glide?" while the water itself stiffens like pudding left too long in the freezer. Travel further east and you reach the Ottoman Empire. Istanbul depends on grain from the Black Sea, but ice chokes harbors and slows barges. Prices spike, riots break out. The Sultan issues stern decrees about fair trade, echoing Louis XIV's struggles. One French envoy notes wryly that the Turks' court and ours both tremble before bread. Historians still argue whether Ottoman shortages worsen regional instability, already bubbling under the empire's surface. Was the frost just a bump in the road, or did it deepen cracks in imperial control? To the north, Baltic trade collapses. Normally, ships ferry timber, tar, and grain, but frozen ports mean docks stand eerily silent. Sweden, already battered by war, finds itself isolated, sailors idle in taverns, grumbling into Waterdale. And here's grim joke number one. One Swede supposedly remarked, "The only cargo moving is complaints." Across the Atlantic, colonies feel the echo. Ships that usually sail from Europe with manufactured goods arrive late or empty because warehouses back home stand bare. In New France, Canada, settlers already accustomed to brutal winters now face reduced supplies. They improvise, leaning more on native allies for corn and game. Quirky detail number two. One missionary records being served beaver tail stew, a delicacy offered during scarcity, chewy and rich in fat. Imagine explaining that recipe on a cooking channel. Today, we're slow braising rodent appendage. Perfect for frostbite season. Sugar colonies in the Caribbean also wobble. Normally, European demand fuels plantations, but with famine at home, fewer ships come to collect molasses and sugar. Warehouses overflow, while enslaved workers labor regardless. Their suffering invisible to the frost-bound courts of Europe. Historians still argue whether the downturn of 1709 meaningfully slowed the brutal Atlantic economy or merely caused a temporary backlog. The evidence is patchy, like frost-nipped parchment. Meanwhile, far-off Asia watches. The Mughal Empire and Qing China don't freeze like Europe, but trade links mean they hear the echoes. European merchants beg for extended credit or stall shipments. In Canton, officials mock Europeans as so weak they shiver to death when water turns white. It's a reminder, global perspectives vary. What seems apocalyptic in Paris might look like clumsy incompetence in Beijing. Within Europe, global imagination also shifts. Pamphlets describe the frost as divine warning not just for one kingdom but for the whole world. Preachers thunder that colonies, too, must repent. It's cosmic PR, a European winter framed as universal punishment. Quirky tidbit number three. One sermon in Lisbon declared that even the parrots in Brazil tremble. Spoiler. They didn't, but the rhetoric sells. Commerce adapts slowly. Dutch traders experiment with storing grain in insulated warehouses. Spanish officials push harder for colonial silver to cover deficits at home. French merchants, desperate, start importing rice from Asia in trickles. An early taste of globalization as survival tool. Historians still argue whether these improvisations mark the dawn of more interconnected food networks or were just temporary flails. Either way, frost forces creativity, and let's not forget the ripple on ideas. Philosophers note how a single winter disrupts empires. See, one English writer muses, "How fragile is our dominion? When frost alone brings princes low, you smile." Global trade, royal might, all undone by frozen raindrops. Grim joke number two. Maybe the true superpower of 1709 wasn't France or England, but Jack Frost himself, conquering continents without firing a musket. By April, ports creak back to life, sails unfurl, and trade resumes. But scars remain. Prices remain erratic. Merchants mistrust supply lines, and colonies remember being neglected. In subtle ways, this winter shakes confidence in Europe's mastery of global networks. If frost can silence ships and starve cities, what else might topple kings? So you drift away from frozen docks and bewildered gondoliers, across seas where wind at last pushes sails again. The frost may have been European-born, but its fingerprints smear across the globe, reminding everyone from Istanbul bakers to Caribbean overseers that climate respects no empire's borders. You keep floating outward, leaving behind the creak of thawing docks and the echo of markets reborn, and you drift into the realm of speculation, where scientists, priests, and common folk alike try to answer the same unnerving question: why did it get so cold? The Great Frost is not only a catastrophe, but also a mystery. And in its icy wake, people begin grasping for explanations that range from the sensible to the strange, from the measurable to the mystical. Some point skyward. Early natural philosophers, armed with fragile thermometers and telescopes, suspect the sun itself has dimmed, After all, sunspots appear irregular, sometimes vanishing altogether for months. Could the sun have gone lazy? Historians still argue whether this links to what modern climatologists call the Maunder minimum, a period of low solar activity thought to coincide with colder weather on Earth. The evidence is debated, but you can almost hear scholars scratching their wigs, muttering, "Perhaps the heavens have simply lost interest in warming us." Others turn to volcanoes. Reports trickle in of eruptions in far-off lands, their ash clouds drifting invisibly, perhaps muting sunlight, without satellite images, though people guess more than they know. A French pamphlet claims smoke from fiery mountains explains the frost. Quirky tidbit number one. One preacher insists that Vesuvius sneezed so hard it blew winter over all Europe. That's not exactly peer-reviewed science, but it has flair. Then there are cycles. Farmers with long memories whisper that every so many generations, the earth takes revenge. They point to famines in the 1500s, floods in the 1600s, weaving a narrative of nature's pendulum swing. Historians still argue whether such folk wisdom preserved kernels of truth about long-term climate rhythms or just spun patterns out of pain. Meanwhile, conspiracy theories sprout. Some accuse foreign powers of sorcery. In Poland, rumors claim Swedes cursed the land during war. In France, pamphlets accuse Protestants of inviting the cold with their heresies. Grim joke number one. Imagine Protestants and Catholics squabbling not just over doctrine, but over who ordered extra snow. Scientific circles, though, begin edging toward modernity. In England, the Royal Society debates barometric pressure, ocean currents, and atmospheric humors. A German naturalist suggests that changes in the Gulf Stream might be chilling Europe. He has no instruments to prove it, but he's sniffing near ideas that scientists centuries later will refine. You nod. The frost accidentally nudges humanity closer to climatology. Ordinary folk still cling to divine explanations. Sermons thunder that the freeze is punishment for greed, vanity, or war. Some say God is angry at kings, others at peasants. It's remarkably flexible theology. Blame whoever you dislike most. Quirky tidbit number two. In one Italian town, clergy organized a parade where citizens carried giant wooden spoons as a plea for God to refill their bowls. You imagine a solemn procession of people waving cutlery heavenward, both tragic and slightly absurd. Yet not all explanations are gloomy. Some see the frost as cleansing. Perhaps, muses one Dutch diarist, God chills the soil so that worms and pests may perish, and future harvests be sweet. This attempt at optimism is brave, if scientifically dubious. Grim joke number two. If the Lord really wanted to smite pests, he also smote half of Europe by mistake. Debates stretch beyond nature into philosophy. Enlightenment thinkers begin spinning theories about humanity's place in a chaotic universe. If frost alone can topple empires, what does that say about human pride? Some suggest humility. Others argue for mastering nature through science and innovation. Historians still argue whether 1709 pushed Europe subtly toward Enlightenment skepticism, or just confirmed people's suspicion that the cosmos is capricious. And then there's the quiet minority who simply shrug. Farmers mutter, weather is weather. They've seen droughts, floods, hailstorms. Why not a mega freeze? Their fatalism contrasts with the elaborate theories of scientists and priests. Sometimes resignation is its own explanation. By spring, the great intellectual blizzard has produced little consensus. Sunspots, volcanoes, divine wrath all coexist in a noisy chorus. What matters most is not accuracy, but narrative. People need reasons to endure suffering. A cause that, even if flawed, is a kind of blanket. Quirky tidbit number three. One Parisian wag publishes a satirical tract claiming that Europe froze because the moon caught a cold. He describes lunar sneezes scattering frost onto Earth. It sells well, proving that even pseudoscience can be entertaining. centuries before internet memes. So you glide out of salons, pulpits, and peasant huts, carrying with you the realization that explanation itself is a survival instinct, whether by telescope, scripture, or spoon-waving parade. People cling to meaning as fiercely as they cling to bread, and though they can't agree on the cause, they all agree on the consequence. The frost is unforgettable, and it demands to be explained, however wildly. You drift forward into the months when ice begins to loosen its grip and the first muddy hints of green return to Europe. The great frost does not end with a sudden snap. It melts away in fits and stutters, like a reluctant guest who lingers at the door. Rivers groan as they break free of their icy shells, and fields slowly reveal what lies beneath the snow. But even as people breathe relief, they find themselves staring at scars, on bodies, on towns, on economies, on memories. The spring of 1709 is messy. Meltwater floods lowlands, turning villages into shallow lakes. Roads dissolve into mud, wagons sink to their axles, and what little grain arrives from distant regions rots in transit. Farmers trudge to their fields only to discover devastation. Orchards split by frost, vines dead down to the roots, wheat stubble brittle as straw. Historians still argue whether the agricultural recovery took one season or many years. Some regions bounced back quickly with replanting. Others lost entire industries, especially winemaking in France, where vines had to be replanted from scratch. Families who survived winter face another cruel phase. Hunger during the so-called lean spring. Granaries are empty, new crops are not yet grown, and reserves exhausted. Quirky tidbit number 1. In some French towns, children gathered tender shoots of nettles to cook as soup. Imagine dinner as a bowl of stinging weeds. Healthy, sure, but hardly comforting. Grim joke number 1 writes itself. Dinner bites back. Communities also reckon with their dead. Cemeteries overflow. Wooden crosses outnumber carved stones. Some villages bury entire families in shared graves. Survivors mark the thaw not with joy but with funerals delayed until ground softens enough to dig it. Yet even here, resilience shows. In Bavaria, villagers plant flowers atop mass graves, a defiant splash of color against loss. Economically, the frost reshapes Europe for years. Grain shortages inflate prices long after thaw. Destabilizing markets, artisans complain that hungry customers can't afford cloth or tools. Royal treasuries, drained by relief and military failures, limp into debt crises. France especially groans. Louis XIII's wars already weaken the state, and the frost deepens the wound. Historians still argue whether the famine helped push France toward its later 18th century financial disasters, the dominoes leading, eventually, toward revolution, but alongside collapse comes adaptation. Merchants experiment with importing food from further afield. Farmers diversify crops, some embracing maize or potatoes where soil allows. Knowledge spreads. People talk of storing grain in sealed granaries, drying vegetables, preserving meat. The frost becomes a kind of harsh teacher. Quirky tidbit number 2. One English pamphlet earnestly advises baking bread with turnip flour, which, according to reviews, tastes as dreadful as it sounds. Innovation doesn't always equal success. Socially, scars show too. Villages remember who shared bread and who hoarded. Families carry grudges for generations, yet some bonds strengthen. Neighbors who pulled each other through now treat one another as kin. Memory reshapes community maps. Kindness and cruelty frozen into reputations. In cities, unrest lingers. Governments worry that another poor harvest could spark revolutions. Spies report tavern mutterings about kings who cannot warm us. Authorities step up surveillance. Fearing frost has weakened loyalty. And they're not entirely wrong. Grim joke number 2. You could say rulers lost more subjects to frostbite than to politics. Artists and writers, too, keep the memory alive. Diaries circulate, poems mourn, and paintings depict frozen rivers. Some works are somber, others bizarre. In the Netherlands, a print shows peasants skating while skeletons lurk nearby, a macabre reminder that joy and death share the same ice. Quirky tidbit number 3. One Parisian song mocked officials, singing, "They tax our fire, but cannot melt the snow." Dark humor as protest anthem. As recovery drags on, people start folding the frost into folklore. Children hear stories of the winter when wolves walk the roads. Grandparents recall it as the year candles burned all night. Historians still argue whether these tales exaggerated events or accurately preserve the trauma. But memory becomes identity. 1709 is not just a date but a milestone, whispered across hearths. And beneath all of this, a new awareness grows, that climate itself can shape destiny. Farmers plant with caution, kings issue decrees with more humility, and philosophers ponder humanity's fragile place. The frost teaches an unshakable lesson. Nature is not just background scenery, but a player on the stage, capricious and mighty. By 1710, fields look greener, markets steadier, but the people who lived through the Great Frost carry it like a shadow. Recovery is never just about bread returning to tables. It's about trust, about fear, about the lingering chill that lives in memory long after the rivers flow free again. You linger now in the long echoes of the Great Frost. When the ice has retreated, but the memory refuses to melt, what lingers is not just hunger or ruined orchards, but a deep unease that hums beneath daily life. A sense that climate itself can betray you without warning. And here, as you drift gently forward in time, you notice how people begin to compare that terror with the shadows we still live under today. Because when you trudge through 1709's ruins, you realize it isn't just their story. It's ours too. Families then asked whether the sun itself was failing, whether volcanoes cursed the sky, whether human sin drew down punishment. Fast forward 3 centuries, and we ask whether greenhouse gases choke the air, whether carbon footprints heat the oceans, whether human choices summon storms. Different causes, same fear. The weather is no longer background scenery. It's the lead actor. Historians still argue whether the Great Frost truly belongs in the same timeline as today's climate debates. But the parallel feels uncanny. Back then, rulers scrambled with decrees, ration laws, and bread edicts. Today, leaders publish pledges, carbon agreements, and emission targets. You can almost hear Louis XIV and a modern politician sighing in harmony. Why won't my subjects believe I can fix the sky? Grim joke number 1. The climate has always been the one electorate you can't win over. Communities then huddled around shared ovens, trading stories, nettle soups, and jokes about coffins. Now, communities gather on screens, sharing hashtags, solar panel tips, or memes about heat waves. The tools are new, but the instinct is the same. Survival through solidarity and laughter. Quirky tidbit number 1. In 1709, Bavarian villagers lit candles of hope each dusk. In 2023, one eco-activist live-streamed a 24-hour candle as a vigil for the planet. Same ritual, different backdrop. And notice this. The frost taught people that crises don't just pass. They shape futures, scarred economies, altered diets, weakened dynasties. Similarly, today's storms and droughts will ripple forward, sculpting politics, migrations, and daily habits. Historians still argue whether societies truly learn from past disasters or simply stumble anew each time. But when you stand in both centuries at once, you feel the pattern. Disaster births adaptation, and adaptation births memory. The strangest link is how personal the impersonal becomes. Frost or heat wave, famine or flood. It isn't numbers on parchment. It's your child crying, your neighbor's hand shaking, your cupboard bare. People then carved wooden spoons as tokens of love. Today, couples install solar panels together or start balcony gardens. Quirky tidbit number 2. One couple in 1709 wrote each other love notes on frost-fogged glass. Last year, Someone proposed marriage by planting a tree with their partner. Romance always finds the climate angle. But there's another echo, denial. In 1709, some shrugged and said, weather is weather. In 2025, some still shrug. Climate is climate. Grim joke number 2. Denial may be the one renewable resource humanity never runs out of. And yet, the frost whispers that even denial cannot erase impact. Orchards still died. Armies still starved. Rulers still panicked. Likewise, today, sea levels don't wait for votes. You, standing between centuries, sense the same urgency. Learn, adapt, imagine, or be caught unprepared. So, the Great Frost becomes not just history but metaphor. A frozen Europe, huddled in huts, reminds us that survival depends not on crowns or decrees but on candles, stories, and stubborn hope. Then and now, the climate humbles us, forces us to rethink, and maybe nudges us closer together. And as you let the echoes fade, the night air feels colder, softer, like the frost brushing past your cheek with one final warning. Now, slow your breathing. Let the noise of riots, of frozen rivers, of kings stamping decrees all fade into a hush. Imagine the snow melting, not suddenly but with a gentle drip. Drip, drip. Each droplet a reminder that no winter is forever. Picture the fields, once shattered by ice, now softening into mud, then greening into meadows. The farmer's hands, cracked and raw, return to planting seeds. Families, once huddled in silence, stretch out in sunlight, telling stories not of despair but of survival. And you, lying here, can feel the rhythm of recovery. Long winters give way to long summers. Harsh nights yield to soft mornings. Even the darkest frost eventually lifts. The memory remains, yes. But memory is not a weight. It's a map. A quiet teacher showing how fragile and how strong we are at once. As your eyes grow heavy, let yourself walk across that thawing field. Hear the faint trickle of streams returning to life. The distant bell of a church calling people not in fear but in gratitude. Smell the earth, damp and promising, ready for new roots. The great frost has ended, and you are safe in the warmth of the present. So let your body loosen, your mind drift. The past is just a story now, carried to you in whispers. You don't need to hold it. You only need to rest. Breathe out. Sink deeper into your pillow, and let sleep wrap you like a softer, kinder blanket than any woven in 1709. The night is yours. Calm and unbroken. Sweet dreams.